B'siyata d'shmai, we're going to learn Yoma Daf Mem Daled. We're going to start at the next Mishnah, approximately halfway into Daf Mem Gimel Amud Beis. Says the next Mishnah, Shachtoi, now the Kohen Gadol, he's done the second vidui, the second confession on his bull. He's now time to shecht the bull. Shachtoi, he shechted the bull. V'kibel, he received the blood. B'mizrak, in a bowl. V'kibel b'mizrak es domoi. V'noisnoi, and he gave it lemisha hu memaris boy, to somebody who was going to stir the blood, because he's not yet ready to sprinkle the blood. That was going to be done a little bit later. In the meantime, in order that the blood should not congeal, somebody would have to stir it. Al harevid haravi'i sheba heichal. And the person that was going to stir the blood would be positioned on the fourth row of marble stones of the flooring, Sheba Heichal, which at this point in the Havamin of the Gemara we assume it means into the Heichal. In the Maskan of the Gemara we'll see it means outside the Heichal, but on the fourth row of flooring, Kadesha lo yikroish, and he would stir it in order that the blood should not congeal. Not al machta. Then the Kohen Gadol would take a shovel, va'olo l'roish hamizbeach, he would go up to the top of the mizbeach, upino gecholim, he would clear away some of the coals, eilech ve'eilech, from one side to the other. He would move them. He would dig into the pile of coals, v'choite min ha'ukolois ha'pnimiois, and he would scoop up from the consumed innermost coals. V'yered, he went down off the mizbeach, v'inicha ala roived haravi'i sheba azara, and he placed it on the fourth row of stones, and this was in the azara. And there's a big discussion in the Rishonim exactly where this was, what this was, but Rashi doesn't go into it here, so we don't need to do that either. Continues the Mishnah, and now the Mishnah is going to tell us 10 differences between the way that the Ketores was done, and not only the Ketores, but between the Avodah that was done on Yom Kippur and the Avodah that was done the whole year. B'chol Yom, every day, the Kohen that was going to take the coals for the Ketores, because we have to remember that the Ketores was done every single day, twice a day. A pras, half a mona of Ketores in the morning, half a mona in the afternoon, and it was annexed to the Korban Tomid, which was also done twice a day. And we've discussed previously exactly when the Ketores was done in relationship to the Korban Tomid. However, on Yom Kippur, besides for doing the regular Ketores, which was actually done on the Mizbeach, the small Mizbeach inside the Heichal, there was another Ketores, which was two fistfuls of Ketores, that was done in the Kodesh HaKadoshim. It was burnt not on coals on the Mizbeach in the Heichal, rather on coals on a shovel in the Kodesh HaKadoshim. So b'chol yom hoyachoyte b'shel kesef, every day when the Kohen would take some coals for the Ketores, it would be done with a scoop, it would be scooped with a shovel made of silver. U'ma'are b'toich shel zov, and then he would pour the coals into a shovel of gold. V'hayoim, but regarding Yom Kippur, choyte b'shel zov, the Kohen Gadol, he would scoop up the coals with a gold shovel, and with it he would go inside. Assuming into the Kodesh Kedoshim, there's a discussion here whether this is talking about the Ketores, or only the Ketores of the Kohen Gadol in the Kodesh HaKadoshim, or also the Ketores that he did in the morning and the afternoon, whether this applied as well. That was number one. Number two, b'chol yom choyte b'shel arba'as kabin, every day he would shovel up, he would scoop up 4 kav of coals with a silver shovel. Uma'ara, he would pour it l'toich shloishes kabin, into a gold shovel which could hold only 3 kav. And we'll learn later that 1 kav spilt over. V'hayoim baton Yom Kippur choyte b'shloishes kavin, he would shovel up, he would scoop up 3 kavin of coals, u'bohoyo machnis, and he would go in with that shovel with those coals. Rabbi Yossi argues with the Tanakama and says that b'chol yom choyte b'shel saw, every day he would shovel up a saw which is 6 kav of coals, u'ma'ara l'toich shloishes kabin, and he would pour it over into a shovel that can hold 3 kav. V'hayoim baton Yom Kippur choyte b'shloishes kavin, like the Tanakama, u'bohoyo machnis, and with it he would he would take it in. Number 3, b'chol yom hoysa kveida, every day the shovel the gold shovel was heavy, But the shovel used on Yom Kippur, the gold shovel of Yom Kippur, kala, it was lighter, the walls were thinner. Number 4, the handle of this shovel on every other day was a regular short handle, but the one that he used on Yom Kippur, aruka, was longer. We'll see in the Gemara this helped him to carry it in. He could put the length of the handle, the end of the handle, under his armpits. It would help him carry it. The Kohen Gadol may have been exhausted from the fast of Yom Kippur. We're trying to help him. Number 5, every day the gold shovel was made of yellow gold, but the shovel of Yom Kippur, Odim, was made of red gold. Divrei Reb Menachem. Continues the Mishnah. Number 6, every day he would offer up a half a monah of ketores in the morning and half a monah in the afternoon. But on Yom Kippur, besides for that, he would do ketores in the Kodesh HaKadoshim with 2 handfuls of ketores. Continues the Mishnah. Number 7, every day the ketores was ground very fine, but on Yom Kippur they would use ketores that was ground even more fine, extra fine. On Erev Yom Kippur they would re-grind the ketores that they would use on Yom Kippur, so it should be dako min adako. Number 8, b'chol yoim kohanim oilim b'mizrachi shel kevesh. The kohen, those that would have to go up onto the mizbeach, would go up on the eastern edge of the ramp, because the eastern edge of the going up on the Mizrach side, as soon as he would reach the top of the ramp, he would turn right, as we know that one always turns right when one starts out, and then going around the Mizbeach, v'yeridin b'marovoi, and when they've gone all the way around the Mizbeach, they would go down on the western side of the ramp, which means that the Kohen never walked beyond the top of the width of the ramp, because it was not necessary. We're not just going hiking, walking on the Mizbeach, one keeps it to a bare minimum. However, but on Yom Kippur, where the Kohen Gadol wanted to display, or we display his honor and the love for Klal Yisrael, and he's doing the avoid on their behalf, then he would walk around the Mizbeach as if he was a Ben Bais, as if he was feeling at home there, and we had little issue if he walked around the entire circumference of the top of the Mizbeach, even flash with the ramp itself, and therefore Kohen Gadol oile be'emtza v'yored be'emtza. The Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur, he would go up in the middle of the ramp, and then when he turned right towards the Tzofoin, then he would be walking across the top of half of the ramp, and on the way back, when he's coming from the Ma'ariv side, then he would walk again across the other half of the ramp and come down in the center of the ramp. Rabbi Yehuda says whenever it was the Kohen Gadol doing the Avodah, even during the year, he would go up in the center and down in the center. Number 9, every other day, the Kohen Gadol would do the Kiddush Yadayim Raglayim, would wash his hands and his feet from the Kier, but on Yom Kippur, min hakitoin shel zav, with a golden flask of water. Rabbi Yehuda again says, Le'olam Kohen Gadol mekadesh yodav raglov min hakitoin shel zav. Even during the year, the Kohen Gadol, whenever he was doing Kiddush Yadayim Raglayim, he would always use a flask of gold. The 10th thing, B'chol Yoim Hoyosham Arba Marachis, the Tanakama or Rabbi Meir says that every day there were 4 fires on the top of the Mizbeach. V'hayoim but on Yom Kippur Chomesh, that was the 5th one. Divrei Reb Meir. Rabbi Yosi says B'chol Yoim Shalosh, every day there were 3 fires. V'hayoim Arba, and there were 4 on Yom Kippur. Rabbi Yehuda Omer B'chol Yom Shtayim V'hayoim Shalosh, every day there were 2, and in Yom Kippur there was 3. And we're going to learn about this in the Gemara, what the different fires served and why there was a different amount for Yom Kippur. Says the Gemara, and we saw at the beginning of the Mishnah that the Kohen Gadol, he shechted his bull, he gave the blood to a Kohen to stir, and where was the Kohen standing? On the 4th row of flooring stones in the Heichal. And then what did the Kohen do? He took the coals from the Mizbeach, from the outside Mizbeach, and he would then go into the Kodesh HaKadoshim to do the Ketores for Yom Kippur. All the while, it seems, this person that was stirring the blood was standing on the Rovid Haravi in the Heichal. Asks the Gemara V'Oksiv, does it not say in the Pasuk, V'chol Adam lo yeh bo'el moed b'voyeh lechapir b'kodesh ad seisoi Does it not say explicitly in the Torah that when the Kohen Gadol goes into the Kodesh HaKadoshim, no one is allowed to be present in the Heichal? Rabbi Yehuda says, Toni shel Heichal. What the Mishnah meant was that this person was not standing in Ala Roivad Aravi'i Sheb Heichal, which would mean the fourth row of stones going into the Heichal, rather, Shel Heichal, beyond the Heichal, outside the Heichal. They would count 4 rows of stones outside the Heichal, and that's where the Kohen would stand and stir the blood, and therefore there was nobody in the Heichal when the Kohen Gadol would go into the Kodesh HaKadoshim. Continues the Gemara Tanu Rabbanon. We learned in a Braisa, V'chol Odom lo yeh bo'el moed. We just saw in the pasuk that when the Kohen Gadol was going into Bavoye lechaper b'kodesh, ad seisoi v'chiper ba'adu v'ad beisoi v'ad kol kal Yisrael. At that point, V'chol Odom lo yeh bo'el moed. Nobody was allowed to be in the Heichal, which corresponded to the Ohel Moed of the Mishkan. So the Gemara, that this Braisa actually starts with Ohel Moed, meaning Ohel Moed proper, which was the Heichal part of the Mishkan. Yochel afilu. We'll soon come back to the Mishkan, but Yochel afilu ba'azara. I may have thought that no one is allowed to be present even outside the Heichal, in the Azara, at the time that the Kohen Gadol is going into the Kodesh HaKadoshim to do the Ketores. Talmud Leimer, Ba'ayal Moed. It says, V'chol Odom lo yeh Ba'ayal Moed. Only in the Heichal, what nobody was allowed to be when the Kohen Gadol went into the Kodesh HaKadoshim. However, in the Azara, Minat Torah, one was allowed to be in any part of the Azara at that time. In the Ela Ba'ayal Moed Sheba Midbar, maybe the Gemara, the Braisa is asking, maybe the whole requirement that nobody should be present in the Ohel Moed was only in the Mishkan, where there was an Ohel Moed. How do you know Shiloi? Maybe the Mishkan that was in Shiloi, which also had an Ohel Moed, or Beis Elomim, or the Heichal of the Beis Hamikdash Minayin. How do you know that from them too nobody was allowed to be present when the Kohen was going into the Kodesh HaKadoshim? Talmud Lema, it says in the pasuk, it says Bakodesh. And the Bakodesh here means that at any place in the Kodesh that nobody was allowed to be present. For some reason, the Braisa, will soon see why, but the Braisa assumes that when it says Kol Odom lo yeh bo'el moed b'voyoi lechaper b'kodesh atzeisoi v'chiper ba'adu v'ad beisoi ba'ad kol kal Yisrael, we assume and take it for granted that that's talking about the time when the Kohen Gadol goes to do the Ketores in the Kodesh HaKadoshim. Then no one is allowed to be present in the Ohel Moed. B'shas matan domim, we know the Kohen Gadol also went into the Kodesh HaKadoshim also to sprinkle the blood of the soyer, the goat, the blood of the bull. He also went into the Kodesh HaKadoshim. Minayin, how do you know that when the Kohen Gadol went into the Kodesh HaKadoshim, not for Ketores, but for matan domim, to sprinkle the bloods, that also the halacha is nobody was allowed to be present in the Ohel Moed? Talmud Leimer, it says in the pasuk, B'voyoi lechaper. The pasuk says, Lo yeh bo'el moed b'voyoi lechaper, when he's coming to atone. And when he's putting the blood in the Kodesh HaKadoshim, it is contributing to the atonement, and therefore then too, nobody was allowed to be present in the Ohel Moed. Ein yelo b'knisasa. When it says b'voyoi, it seems to be when he's going in. Maybe only when he's going into the Kodesh HaKadoshim to do this avodah, then nobody was allowed to be present in the Heichal. B'yitziyasu minayin. How do you know that when the Kohen Gadol was finished doing the avodah in the Kodesh HaKadoshim and was on his way out, how do you know that then too nobody was allowed to be present in the Ohel Moed? Talmud Lema, it says in that same pasuk, ad tzeisoi, it says b'voyei lechaper b'kodesh, ad tzeisoi, from when going in to the Kodesh, or when going in lechaper b'kodesh, ad tzeisoi, till coming out, until he's out, nobody was allowed to be in the Heichal. The Apostle continues, what was he doing in the Kodesh HaKadoshim? V'chiper ba'adoi u'ba'ad beisoi v'ad kol kal Yisrael. He was atoning for himself, his own Averis, the Averis of his family, and the Averis of the whole of Klal Yisrael. Says the Gemara, V'chiper ba'adoi u'ba'ad beisoi v'ad kol kal Yisrael. The order is very significant. And we're going to read the Gemara according to the version of the Vilna Gaon. Kaparosoi kuidemis lekaparas ochiv hakoyanim. His kapara was before the kapara of the other Kohanim. As we saw, he first made the confession for himself and his family, and only later did he do the confession on behalf of the Kohanim. The kaporas ochiv ha-Kohanim kodemis lekaporas kol Klal Yisrael, and the confession he did on behalf of the rest of Klal Yisrael was done at even a later point. We haven't learnt about that yet. Continues the Gemara, Omar Mar. We just learnt in this brisa that Eini elo b'shas haktorah, that I would have thought, and I took for granted, that the pasuk that says that nobody's allowed to be in the Hazara when the Kohen Gadol goes into the Kodesh HaKadoshim, we would have thought it's only talking about when he's doing the Ketores in the Kodesh HaKadoshim. And then we needed an extra pasuk when it said B'Kodesh to tell us that even, not B'voye Lechaper, we needed the extra words, B'voye Lechaper, to say that even when he went in to do the blood, not for the Ketores, it was also for anyone to be in the oil moed. My mashma. What would have made you think that this pasuk is talking about Ketores? Omar Rava, v'chein Omar Yitzchok bar Avdimi, v'chein Omar Beloza. Three Amiroim, they all said Omar Kro. From the end of the pasuk, it's apparent, because what does it say at the end of the pasuk? As we just saw, v'chipeir ba'adei u'ba'ad beisei u'ba'ad kol Klal Yisrael, that he went into the Kodesh HaKadoshim to atone for himself, for his brethren, for his home, and for the rest of Klal Yisrael. Asks. And so the Gemara says, these Amiroim say, Ezu kapora sheshov eloi ule'echov ha'kohanim u'lechol Klal Yisrael. Which part of the avodah was equal, was done simultaneously for all of these, also himself, also the Kohanim, and also Klal Yisrael? Havoimer is aktoras Ketores. That was the Ketores, because regarding the blood that went in, he did the confession for himself and for the Kohanim on one korban, on the goat, the confession of the not on the goat, on the bull, and the confession for Klal Yisrael he did on the goat, which we're going to see later on. And so the bloods that were put into the Kodesh HaKadoshim, they atoned at different times, or it was different stages for the atonement of himself, the Kohanim, and Klal Yisrael. But the Ketores was equal for everybody. Uktores mechaperes? Are you suggesting that Ketores was brought in order to atone? Where would you know that from? Says the Gemara, yes, Da'atani Reb Chananya. Chananya said, Lamadnu l'Kteres shemechaperes. How do we know that Ketores atones? Shneimar, it says in the pasuk, Vayitein es haKteres, that he placed the Ketores, Vayechaper al ha'am, and the Ketores atoned for the people. So you see from here that Ketores is used as to atone. V'tana de Rabbi Shmuel, the brisa of Rabbi Shmuel, they added on Alma Ketores mechaperes. What specifically is the Ketores atoning for? A lashon hara, for the avera of lashon hara. Yavoi davar shebechashoyi, the Ketores, which is done very much in private, is done lifnai v'lifnim. No one was allowed to be there. It was done on the quiet, and it will come and atone v'yichaper al ma'aseh bechashoyi, and will atone for lashon hara, which is generally done quietly. A person whispers the gossip. He doesn't want other people to know he's talking about it. He does it quietly. And therefore, it's the Ketores in the Kodesh HaKadoshim which will atone for it. Continues the Gemara. Tanan Hasam, we learned in a Mishnah in Masechet Kelim. Perushin mibein ha'ulam v'lamizbeach b'shas ha'ktara. Till now, all we've learned is, and we've learned from the Psukim, is that when the Kohen Gadol would go into the Kodesh HaKadoshim, either to do the Ketores or for the Matan Domim, nobody was allowed to be in the Heichal. Outside the Heichal, in the Azara, we didn't find any issue with that. And indeed, Minatayra, that's going to be the Maskana. Minatayra, there is no Issa to be in the Azara, whilst the Kohen Gadol is in the Kodesh HaKadoshim. So in the Mishnah it says that when the Kohen Gadol, B'shas HaKtorah, we'll soon see what that means, but when he was doing the Ketores, then nobody was allowed, not only in the Heichal were they not allowed to be, they were also not allowed to be in the 22 Amos between the Heichal, between the Ulam, and the Mizbeach. That Perushin, they would separate themselves, they would move away, Mibein ha'ulam u'lamizbeach, b'shas ha'ktara, when he was doing the Ketores. And we'll have to soon see whether this is talking about the Ketores that he did when in the Kodesh HaKadoshim, or is he talking about the Ketores that he did in the Heichal? Because we said before that in the Heichal also there was the regular Ketores. And there also there's a halacha that when it's learned from explicit psukim, that when the Kohen Gadol, or when any Kohen the whole year was doing the Ketores in the Heichal, nobody was allowed to be in the Heichal. So we'll soon see what this means. Omer Rabbi Elazar says, Lo yishonu, this that it says in the Mishnah Masechet Kenim, that they had to go separate themselves and be purish from Bein HaUlam LaMizbeach, which was part of the Azora. Lo yishonu elo b'shas haktorah the Heichel. That's only true when the Kohen Gadol, on Yom Kippur it was the Kohen Gadol, he did the Ketores, or the whole year, when anyone did the Ketores in the Heichel, the regular Ketores, then the people would have to separate themselves from the area Bein HaUlam LaMizbeach, which was just adjacent to the Heichel. Maybe just as soon as the Ketores is being done in the Heichel, they'll get drawn, they might want to watch, or they'll get drawn into the Heichel, which is Asa. And therefore, Bein HaUlam LaMizbeach, no one was allowed to be there. But when the Kohen Gadol went and did the Ketores in the Kodesh HaKadoshim, there we were not concerned that somebody who was going to be Bein Ulam LaMizbeach would walk in there, would walk into the Heichel, and therefore from the Heichel, Meheichel Paroshi, the Pasuk says that in the Heichel no one was allowed to be there, that's the Oil Moed, but Mi Bein Ulam LaMizbeach, Loi Paroshi. Which means that, just to summarize, when the Ketores was done either in the Kodesh HaKadoshim or in the Heichal, no one was allowed to be in the Heichal. When the Ketores was done in the Heichal, then not only were they not allowed to be in the Heichal, which is Min HaTorah, but Midrabanon they were also not allowed to be Bein HaUlam LaMizbeach. Mosiv Rav Ada bar Ava v'Omri lo K'di. Rav Ada bar Ava, and some say that we don't know, it was an anonymous person who asked the question. They asked from the following brisa of Rabbi Yossi. And this is going to be a little bit of a cryptic brisa. We're going to have a few ways of reading it. And according to one way of learning it, the first way of reading it, it's going to present a contradiction to what Rabbi Elazar just said now. What did Rabbi Elazar say? Rabbi Elazar said that when the Ketores was done in the Kodesh HaKadoshim, there was no issue, there was no chiyuv of prisha bein ha'ulam lamizbeach. What did Rabbi Yossi say? Rabbi Yossi Omer, Kishem sheporshin mi bein ha'ulam v'lamizbeach. In the same way as there was a chiyuv to separate themselves, that no one should be present, bein ha'ulam lamizbeach, b'shas haktorah. We don't know what this means yet, but the Gemara assumes it means b'shas when you're doing the Ketores in the Kodesh HaKadoshim, not the Ketores in the Heichal. The Kodesh HaKadoshim, that you had to be pirish from bein ulam lamizbeach. This is squarely not like Rabbi Elazar. But what does Rabbi Yossi say? In the same way as when they were doing the Ketores in the Kodesh HaKadoshim, nobody was allowed to be bein ha'ulam lamizbeach. Kach Pershin, so too no one was allowed to be bein ulam lamizbeach when the avodos in the Heichal were being done. Which avodos? B'shas matan par kohen Mashiach upar helam dovo shel tzibur usiirei avodas kechovim. And these are called Porim HaNisrofim and Seirim HaNisrofim, which I don't want to go into now. The details of them, there's Masechtas later in Shas and Prokim in Shas, which will discuss them in detail. But there were certain types of chatois that would either bulls or goats, that actually the animals themselves were burnt outside, and the blood was put inside the Heichal, sprinkled towards the curtain between the Heichal and the Kodesh HaKadoshim. The blood was also positioned on the inside Mizbeach, and the fats were put onto the big Mizbeach, but the animals themselves were burnt outside. That's why they're called Porim HaNisrofim and Seirim HaNisrofim. So there was a Matan Domim in the Heichal. But the Seirim HaNisrofim and the Porim HaNisrofim, the blood was placed in the Heichal, on the little Mizbeach, the Mizbeach HaPnimi, and towards the curtains. So that's called Matan Domim in the Heichal. And the same applies, it's not only the Matan Domim in the Heichal, but the same is also the blood of the So'ir and the Par that was also done in the Heichal. Not only on Kodesh HaKadoshim did the Kohen Gadol take the blood of the goat and the bull into the Kodesh HaKadoshim and sprinkle the blood between the poles of the Oren, he also sprinkled the blood and positioned it on the Mizbeach in the Heichal. When any avodah of Matan Domim was done in the Heichal, it was also for anybody to be bein ha'ulam lamizbeach. And so what comes out from this, from the Brisa? When do we find there's a stringency of the Heichal over bein ulam lamizbeach? In what case are you not allowed to be in the Heichal, but you are allowed to be bein ulam lamizbeach? Because we just said now, when doing the Ketores in the Kodesh HaKadoshim, that no one was allowed to be even ben ulam lamizbeach. When doing the matan domim in the heichal, no one was allowed to be ben ulam lamizbeach. So when was one allowed to be ben ulam lamizbeach? Elo shebeheichal Pershim bein b'shas haktorah, bein shaloi b'shas haktorah. Now, what happens when, because we've spoken so far, matan domim in the heichal. We've spoken about the ketores in the kodesh hakadoshim. What about the matan domim in the kodesh hakadoshim? Did they have to stay away from the ulam lamizbeach? So the Brisa says no. That from the heichal, they would stay away, Pershin, Bein B'Shas HaKtorah. Also, at the time where they did the Ketores in the Kodesh HaKadoshim, that's how we're learning it for now, and Ubein Shalei B'Shas HaKtorah. And also, when they were not doing the Ketores in the Kodesh HaKadoshim, what were they doing? The Matan Domim. When they were doing the Matan Domim in the Kodesh HaKadoshim, also one had to stay away from the Heichal. However, bein ha'ulam lamizbeach, ein pershin elo b'shas haktorah. Only when they were doing the ketores in the kodesh hakadoshim did they have to stay away from the bein ulam lamizbeach. But when they were doing the matan domim in the kodesh hakadoshim, then they would not have to stay away from bein ulam lamizbeach. So that's the original reading of the Brisa of Rabbi Yossi. So the Gemara says b'shas haktorah. So what do we see here? It's clear from the way we read the Brisa that whilst they were doing b'shas haktorah, once the Kohen was doing the ketores in the Kodesh HaKadoshim, miha paroshi, they would have to stay away from the bein ulam lamizbeach. My love, b'shas haktorah delifnai v'lifnim. We're assuming that when it says that b'shas haktorah you have to be separated from bein ulam lamizbeach, we're talking about the haktorah in the Kodesh HaKadoshim, and this is against what Rabbi Loza said. Rabbi Loza said that only when doing the ketores in the heichal does one have to go away from between ulam lamizbeach, but when doing the ketores in the Kodesh HaKadoshim there was no such need, and that seems to contradict what Rabbi Yossi said. Answers the Gemara, no. You have to reread the Brisa. Loi b'shas haktorah deheichal. When it said, let's go back to the beginning of the Brisa of Rabbi Yossi, when Rabbi Yossi said, Kashem she'pershin mibein ha'ulam lamizbeach b'shas haktorah, it doesn't mean the shas haktorah in the Kodesh HaKadoshim. No, it means b'shas haktorah in the heichal. When doing the ketores in the heichal, nobody was allowed to be bein ulam lamizbeach. And then, kach, in the same way as doing the ketores in the heichal, no one was allowed to be bein ulam lamizbeach. Kach pershim b'shas matan par kohen Mashiach par elam davar shel tzibur irav kechovim. So too, any matan domim done in the heichal, no one was allowed to be bein ulam lamizbeach, which conforms with what Rabbi Loza said, that only when the avodas are done in the heichal, they had to separate from bein ulam lamizbeach. But the avodas done in the kodesh hakadoshim would not require people to stay away from the area bein ulam lamizbeach. And then the Brisa carries on that in what case is the heichal more stringent than the bein ulam lamizbeach? In what case does one have to separate from the heichal and not from the bein ulam lamizbeach? And so what we saw before is that b'shas matan domim in the kodesh hakadoshim, even before we said that when the blood was put in the kodesh hakadoshim, one does not need to separate bein ulam lamizbeach. But now that we've changed, now that we're conforming with what Rabbi Loza said, even when doing the ketores in the kodesh hakadoshim, one did not have to separate from the area bein ulam lamizbeach. So we now have two different avodos which require separating from the heichal and not from bein ulam lamizbeach. One is b'shas matan domim in the kodesh hakadoshim, and two is b'shas the ketores in the kodesh hakadoshim. That in both cases one has to stay away from the heichal, not from the bein ulam lamizbeach. So now, but the Brisa didn't say that. The Brisa just said that ma lo yesh bein heichal bein ulam lamizbeach, and the Brisa just said one thing: Elo shebeheichal pershin bein b'shas haktorah bein shaloi b'shas haktorah. That from the heichal you only have to stay away when doing the ketores, but not when doing the shaloi b'shas haktorah, which is b'shas the matan domim. the Brisa seemed to ignore this point that we've just added, thanks to Rebbe Loza, that even b'shas the Haktorah in the Kodesh HaKadoshim, one didn't have to separate from the Ulam LaMizbeach, and that's the Gemara is going to deal with that now. Says the Gemara, if so, when the Brisa wants to know in what cases does one have to stay away from the Heichal and not from the Ulam LaMizbeach, then what did the Brisa say? That Shalei b'shas Haktorah, that b'shas Matan Domim in the Kodesh HaKadoshim, you didn't have to stay away bein Ulam LaMizbeach. V'suloi, there's no other case. Ha'ika ha'mayla. You've got another Maila that we just discussed now. De'ilu mehechal parshi bein b'shas Haktorah didei, bein b'shas Haktorah de lifnai v'lifnim. That from the Heichal you have to stay away, both when doing the Ketores in the Heichal and when doing the Ketores in the Kodesh HaKadoshim. V'ilu bein Ulam LaMizbeach, but staying away from in the area between the Ulam and the Mizbeach, Loi parshi elo b'shas Haktorah de Heichal. Only when doing the Ketores in the Heichal, then you have to stay away from the area bein Ulam LaMizbeach. But when doing the Ketores in the Kodesh HaKadoshim, you don't need to stay away from the area bein Ulam LaMizbeach, as Rabbi Loza said, and as we read into the beginning of the Brisa. So why did the second part of the Brisa, when discussing the stringencies of the Heichal over the Bein Ulam LaMizbeach, why didn't the Brisa say that? Answers the Gemara, it did. Haktani. That's exactly what the Brisa meant. When the Brisa said that b'shas Haktorah, the one had to stay away from the Bein Ulam LaMizbeach and Shaloi b'shas Haktorah not, it doesn't mean that Shaloi b'shas Haktorah, that at the time of doing the Matan Domim, which is not Ketores, it's Domim in the Kodesh HaKadoshim. It actually meant that Shaloi b'shas Haktorah in the Heichal, which means when the Haktorah was done in the Heichal, the Ketores of the Heichal, then you had to stay away, Ben Ulam LaMizbeach. But the Ketores, which means Shaloi b'shas Haktorah of Heichal, but yes, b'shas Haktorah of Kodesh HaKadoshim, you don't need to stay away from Ben Ulam LaMizbeach. That's exactly what the Brisa means. Haktoni elo shebeheichal porshin bein b'shas Haktorah bein Shaloi b'shas Haktorah. In the Heichal, you have to stay away both when you're doing the Haktorah in the Heichal and when not doing the Haktorah in the Heichal, when doing the Haktorah in the Kodesh HaKadoshim. In both cases, you have to stay away from the Heichal. But umi bein Ulam LaMizbeach in porshin elo b'shas Haktorah, but staying away from the area bein Ulam LaMizbeach, you only have to separate yourself from there b'shas Haktorah of the Heichal. Says the Gemara, okay, so if the Brisa is only mentioning that Maila, that b'shas the Haktorah of in the Kodesh HaKadoshim, you do not need to stay away from the area bein Ulam LaMizbeach, then why don't you mention the second Maila, that b'shas Matan Domim in the Kodesh HaKadoshim, you also don't need to stay away from the area bein Ulam LaMizbeach, which everybody always agreed with that. Initially we thought that's what the Brisa is saying. Now that we say the Brisa means Shas Haktorah in the Kodesh HaKadoshim, why doesn't the Brisa also say b'shas Matan Domim of the Kodesh HaKadoshim? Why don't you add that in? That in the Heichal you have to stay away also by the Matan Domim that you do in the Heichal, and also the Matan Domim of the Lifnai v'Lifnim in the Kodesh HaKadoshim. Ve'ilu mi bein Ulam LaMizbeach. However, to stay away from the Ulam LaMizbeach, lo parshi elo b'kedusha de Heichal. You only need to stay away from the area bein Ulam LaMizbeach when doing the Matan Domim in the Heichal, not when doing the Matan Domim in the Kodesh HaKadoshim. Omar Rava says you're right. The Brisa means both. Shem prisha achasi. When it says Shaloi b'shas Haktorah, you have to stay away from the Heichal, but not from the area bein Ulam LaMizbeach. It means also the Shas Haktorah of in the Kodesh HaKadoshim, and also b'shas Matan Domim in the Kodesh HaKadoshim. Continues the Gemara, Omar Mar. What did we see in the Brisa? Kach po'ilshim b'shas Matan Parkoin Mashiach u'Par Helam Dovo Shel Tzibur U'Siri Avodas Kechovim. We saw that the Brisa said that whilst putting the blood in the Heichal, for those korbanos known as the Porim HaNisrofim and the Seirim HaNisrofim, nobody was allowed to be in the Heichal. Not only in the Heichal, they were not allowed to be bein Ulam LaMizbeach. Minalon, what would be the source that the Chiyuv of Prisha applies even by the Porim HaNisrofim and Seirim HaNisrofim? Omer of Pedos, Asya Kapora Kaporam Yom Kippurim. We learn out to Gzera Shova. It says Kapora regarding the nisrofim. It says kapora regarding Yom Kippur. In the same way as Yom Kippur, it says explicitly that when the avodah was done bifnim, nobody was allowed to be in the heichal. So too regarding these porim and seirim hanisrofim. Continues the Gemara Omer of Achabar Ava. Shma mino. From this Mishnah, from the halachas we've just learnt now, we can see that Mailois Doiraisa. What does it mean, Mailois Doiraisa? There's a Mishnah in Masechet Kelim. The first parak in Kelim, Mishnah Ches, the Mishnah there speaks about the Asara Kedusha, is the 10 different levels of Kedusha. And in that Mishnah it says that one of the levels is that bein ulam la mizbeach minu azara, that the area between the ulam and the mizbeach and the rest of the azara have a different level of kedusha. So the Gemara is saying that it must be that whole Mishnah Maseches Kelim, it's min haTorah, that it has a different level of kedusha. It must be it's deiraisa. V'hochig mirila. And it must be that that's how they had the halacha l'Moshe Sinai, that min haTorah, this area has a different level of kedusha than the rest of the azara. If you say that it's only midrabanon that there's a difference between the area bein ulam lamizbeach and the azara, then ma'ishno bein ulam lamizbeach. Why did the Chachomim say that you're not allowed to be in the area bein ulam lamizbeach when doing any of the avodas, either k'teres or matan domim in the heichal? Why did they say you have to stay away from there? Dilma mikri v'ayli, maybe by mistake you'll go into the heichal where the avodah is being done. Mikule azara nami nifrashu. Maybe in the whole azara, somebody might by mistake come and Dilma mikri v'ayli, he'll chance onto the heichal and go into the heichal, which is awesome in haTorah. So the Rabbanon should have said nobody's allowed to be in the whole azara when the avodah was being done in the heichal. So, and the fact that you see that the Chachomim said no, only bein ulam lamizbeach you have to stay away, it must be they knew that min haTorah this area had halachas of its own. As answers the Gemara, there's no proof. It could be it's midrabanon. And you ask me why the Rabbanon chose that bein ulam lamizbeach is the only area that you have to stay away. It makes sense. Bein ulam lamizbeach kiven dolei mafsik midi. Since there's no separation when you're in that area, there's nothing between you and the heichal. Loy minkra milsa. It's not recognizable, and there's nothing stopping you going into the heichal, and therefore they were afraid. Azara, but in the rest of the Azara, given the ikam mizbeach achitza in the mafsik, since you've got the mizbeach, the outside mizbeach in the Azara, which separates between the people and the heichal, minkra milsa, everybody will remember, it's clearly defined, and nobody will chance into the heichal by mistake, and therefore the Chachomim did not find it necessary to say that you have to stay away from the rest of the Azara. Omar Rava. Rava says that Shema Mino Kedushas Ulam v'Heichal Chodem Miltzihi. We've conveniently ignored the whole concept of the Ulam. What's the halacha of the Ulam? Does it have the halachas of Heichal? The Ulam was the entranceway between the area bein ha'Ulam lamizbeach and the Heichal. It was an entranceway into the Heichal. Did that have the same halachas as Heichal? Did it have the same halachas as Azara, as bein ulam lamizbeach? That means the same halachas, that it's only also midrabanon. So Rava says it must be that the area bein ulam lamizbeach is one kedusha, and the same way as min haTorah, you're not allowed to go into. No one's allowed to be in the heichal when the avodah was done, either in the heichal or in the kodesh hakedoshim. So too, no one was allowed to be in the ulam when those avodas were done. Why would I know that, says Rava? If you're going to say that really the heichal is just the heichal, and the ulam is a different level of kedusha, and if so, when the Torah says you're not allowed to be in the heichal, it's only the heichal, and the ulam is not included in heichal. If so, ulam gufei gzeira, why were you not allowed to go into the ulam? As a gzeira, maybe you'll go into the heichal. So that's the ulam is one gezerah. The area outside the ulam, ben ulam lamizbeach, is a gezerah legezerah. It's to make sure you don't go into the ulam, which the ulam itself is you're not allowed. It's only also midrabanon. V'neika v'nigzer gezerah legezerah. Answers the Gemara, no, you don't have a proof. Loi ulam ubein ulam lamizbeach chod kedusha. The truth is that the heichal is on its own, and is not the same kedusha as the ulam. However, the ulam has the same kedusha as the area bein ulam lamizbeach. And therefore, it's one gezerah, and heichal v'ulam shtei kedushos. However, heichal and the ulam is two kedushos, and according to this, if the Gemara is according to this maskon of the Gemara, then indeed it will only be osam midrabanon to be bein ha'ulam, to be in the ulam, and it will only be osa, and in those times when it's osa to be bein ha'ulam lamizbeach, which is when the avodas are done in the heichal, not when the avodas are done in the kodesh hakadoshim. Continues the Gemara. Now we're going back to the Mishnah. The Gemara is going to start discussing the 10 differences between Yom Kippur and the other days. Every day he would shovel up the coals for the regular ketores in the Heichal with a silver shovel, and in Yom Kippur he would use a gold shovel. Why would they not use a gold shovel the whole year? There's sources, we've seen this before already, Daf Lametes, that the Torah had pity on, didn't want to waste and lose money. Well, it's learnt out from the parish of Metzora. We don't need to go into that now, but we see from the Torah expects us to be careful and not to waste money. Since shoveling up the coals causes the shovel to get rubbed down and to get scratched away, therefore they would use a harder, a more stronger material of silver. Continues the Gemara. Vayayim chayte b'shel zav u'bahoyo machnis. That on Yom Kippur he would go in to the Kodesh HaKadoshim, or he would go in, we said it's a discussion in the Mefarshim which Ketores is talking about, but on Yom Kippur he would use a gold shovel to scoop up the coals, and with that he would go in. Ma'itama, why would you use a gold one? Mishum chulsha de Kohen Gadol, because the Kohen Gadol is exhausted, and we want him to use a lighter material, and the gold shovels were lighter and easier to carry, and therefore that's what he used. And it's true that it would get rubbed down, but since they're only shoveling once a year with it, on Yom Kippur, they were not so concerned. Continues the Gemara, B'chol Yom B'shel Arba'as Kabin V'chulu. We saw in the Mishnah, Machlekes Tanoim, as to how big the shovel was the whole year. The first Tana said that B'chol Yom, the Tanakama said every day they would shovel up 4 kav and pour it into a gold shovel of 3 kav, and in Yom Kippur they would just shovel 3 kav and go in with it. Rabbi Yossi says every day they would shovel with a saw, which is 6 kav, and pour it into a shovel of 3 kav. So according to the Chachomim, 1 kav would spill over, because they would shovel up 4 kav and put it into a shovel of 3 kav. According to Rabbi Yossi, he would shovel up 6 kav and pour it into 3 kav, according to him, it would seem that 3 kav would get spilt over. We'll soon see in the Gemara. Says the Gemara, B'chol yom b'shel arba kabin v'chulu, Tana. We learned in a brisa, Masechet Tomid, Nispazru loy kav gecholim mechabdon la'ama. That when he would pour over the coals every day, a single kav of coals would spill over, would fall on the floor, because there wouldn't be space in the second shovel, and he would sweep them away into the stream, the Oma, which was a stream that was going through the Azara. Tanya Choda Kav, but Tanya Idoch Kabayim. One Tana actually says Kav, as we just said now, and a different Tana said 2 Kav got spilt over. So the Gemara says, Bishlei mehachta toni kav, the opinion that says that 1 kav spilt over is the Rabbanon. They shoveled up 4 kav, they poured it into a shovel of 3 kav, 1 kav spilt over. Elo hachta toni kabayim, but this Tana who holds that 2 kav spilt over, money, who is it? Lo Rabbanon, it's not the Rabbanon who said that 1 kav spilt over. V'lo Rabbi Yossi, it's not Rabbi Yossi who said that 3 kav spilt over. So there's going to be 2 answers in the Gemara. Omer of Chizda, Rabbi Shmuel b'nei Rabbi Yochanan ben Beroika. That Tana is actually Rabbi Shmuel, the son of Rabbi Yochanan ben Beroika. The Tanya Rabbi Shmuel b'nei Rabbi Yochanan ben Beroika Omer b'shel kabayim hoya machnis. That he says that they poured it not into a shovel of 3 kav, rather into a shovel of 2 kav, and with that they would go into the heichal. And if you poured from 4 kav to 2 kav, then 2 kav will spill over. Because in the Mishnah, both Tanoim learnt that it was spilt into a shovel of 3 kav. This machlokes was 6 kav shoveled up, or was 4 kav shoveled up. But now, according to Rabbi Shmuel b'nei Rabbi Yochanan ben Beroika, the 4 kav was shoveled up, and 2 kav was taken into the heichal. Rabashi says, "Afilatemi Rabbi Yossi." It could even be Rabbi Yossi who says that a saw was shoveled up, which we assume to mean 6 kav, and he poured it into a shovel of 3 kav. How many spilt over? 3. How is that going to be the Tana of the Brisa that says 2 kav spilt over? It says, yeah, it's a different type of 2 kav. I'll explain it to you. V'achikama, says the Gemara. The shovel they would shovel the coals with had 6 saw of midborios, which is each saw was measured according to this, each kav or saw was measured according to the measure that it was in the midbar. And that corresponded approximately to 5 kav Yerushalmi. In Yerushalayim, later on, they made every measure larger. What was a kav before, now to be a kav you need even more. So what was initially 6 kav is now 5 kav. When it says, so everyone agrees that the first shovel, when they shoveled up the coals, it was 6 kav of midbar, 6 smaller kavim. When they poured it into the second shovel, it says in the Mishnah, shloisha kavim, but this wasn't shloisha kavim of the midbar. This was shloisha kavim Yisra Yerushalmius. And shloisha kavim of Yerushalmius, how much did we say 6 kav of midborios is 5 kav Yerushalmios, poured into 3 kav Yerushalmios, so 2 kav Yerushalmios got spilt over. And 2 kav Yerushalmios is more than 2 kav midborios. So it's similar to what we said before, that it's 3 kav spilt over, yes, but when you measure it relative to the kavim Yerushalmios, it's closer to 2 kav. Continues the Gemara, every day the spade, the shovel that he took he carried the coals with was heavy. It was light. Every day the material, the gold material of the shovel that he used every day was much thicker and therefore it was heavier. It was lighter. And the reason it was lighter is because the walls were made of a softer, thinner gold. Continues the Gemara, B'chol Yom Hoisa Ktsara, the handle, the yoda, the handle of the shovel used every day was a short handle, V'ayom, but the one on Yom Kippur, Aruka, was longer. Ma'itama, Kedei Shetei Zroya Shel Kohen Gadol Maseyato, in order that his arm, he would put the end of the handle under his armpits, so his arm and his armpit would help him with the carrying the weight of the shovel. It was easier, and we're taking into consideration the exhaustion of the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur. Continues the Gemara, Tana, there was now another difference, which is mentioned in the Brisa, B'chol Yom lo hayol ani ashtik. Every other day, the gold shovel that was used to take the coals into the Heichal did not have a ring at the end of it. V'hayom ba'on Yom Kippur hayol ani ashtik. It had this loop at the end of it, in order that when he would go in, it would make a sound. And it says, V'nishma koile b'vayel HaKodesh. It was important that when the Kohen Gadol came in, that they would be able to hear that he was coming in. And therefore there was this ring hanging on the handle of the shovel. Divrei Ben Hasgan, that's what, then the Brisa quotes this in the name of Ben Hasgan. Continues the Gemara, B'chol Yom Hoisa Zahav Yorik, every other day, coming back to the Mishnah, every day the gold shovel was made of a yellow gold, and in Yom Kippur it was made of a red gold. Omer of Chizda. Rav Chizda says, Shiva Zahavim Hein. There are 7 types of gold. Number 1 is Zahav, regular gold, and one is called Zahav Toiv. And we're going to see that this is learnt from a pasuk, where the pasuk says, Uzahav ha'oretz hahi Toiv. So we see that there was a good and a less good gold. That's the first 2. Then there's something called V'zahav Oifir. And this is a pasuk in Melachim. It says, "V'gam oni chiro mashenosa zohov me'oifir." There was a concept called zohov me'oifir. There was another one called v'zohov mupaz, and this is also a pasuk in Melachim. Vayas hamelech kisei shein gadol vayetzapehu zohov mufaz. Another one v'zohov shachut. This is a pasuk also in Melachim where it says, "Vayas hamelech shloimo mosayim tzino zohov shachut." So there's a concept called zohov shachut. There's another one. Also in Melachim, is all in Melachim Aleph Perek Yud. And the pasuk says there, "V'chol kli mashke hamelech shloimi zov v'chol kli beis yara levonin zov sogur." Another type of gold. And there's another pasuk in Divrei Yomim, v'zohov parvoyim. The pasuk says, "Vaytzafes habayis even yikoro leteferes v'hazov zahav parvoyim." So that's what Rav Chizda said, and the Gemara is going to explain. Zahav v'zahav toiv. That's from a pasuk. The Siv, it says in the pasuk in Bereshis, Zahav ha'oretz hahi toiv, that the gold of that land was good. So you see that there's a good and there's a regular gold. Zahav Oifir. Zahav Oifir, Da'asim Oifir. It came from the place called Oifir. Zahav Mupaz. Why was it called this way? Shedoime lepaz, because it was shiny, it shone like poz, like pearls. Zahav Shachut. What's the Zahav Shachut? The Shachut is from the words chut as a thread. Shenitve, it was so thin it could be spun like a thread. Zahav Sogur. What's the Zahav Sogur? It was such an amazing type of gold that b'shor sheniftach kol hachanuyos, b'shor sheniftach kol hachanuyos nizgoris. When the shop selling this gold would open, it would cause all the other shops selling gold to be closed because everybody would come specifically for this gold. Zahav Parvoim, Shedoim Ledam Haporim, this gold called Parvoim was a red gold which has similar colouring to the blood of a bull. Rashi says actually Chamishahin, there's only 5 types of gold. As we saw, the latter 5, Zahav Oifir, Zahav Mufaz, Zahav Shochot, Zahav Sogur, and Zahav Parvoim. V'kol chad v'chad, this pays Zahav, Zahav Toiv, and in each one of these types of golds, there was a better quality and there was a less good quality. But Toiv and the regular Zahav and Zahav Toiv is not a different type of gold, it's just a different quality of gold in each of the 5 types. Tanya Namihachi, we also found a brisa, like we saw before, that the reason that the gold is called Parvoim is because it was similar to the color of the blood of the bull. Is also, we see this in a brisa. Every day the gold shovel would be of yellow gold, and in Yom Kippur it would be red gold. Zahav Parvoim, and this is the shovel used on Yom Kippur was made of Zahav Parvoim, which is this red gold, which is a similar colouring to the blood of the bulls, as we said before. And in the next shiur we're going to continue from here.